I stood in the grand dining room of the Whitmore estate, the chandelier casting a cold, crystalline glow over the polished mahogany table. My heart pounded, not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. The Rolex I'd spent months saving for a gesture of respect. A plea for acceptance lay discarded on the floor, its face cracked from where my father-in-law, Richard Whitmore, had hurled it. A fraud, he'd called me, his voice dripping with venom, his eyes glinting with the kind of superiority only old money breeds. The word echoed in my skull, sharp and jagged, cutting deeper than I'd expected. I wasn't born into wealth like my wife, Eleanor, or her family. I'd clawed my way up, built a name in finance through sweat and sleepless nights. But to Richard, I was nothing more than a grifter who'd seduced his daughter for her fortune. Eleanor's hand trembled in mine under the table, her silence louder than her father's tirade. She loved me, so I thought, but her loyalty to her family was a chain I hadn't yet broken. Her mother, Beatrice, sat primly, her lips pursed, while her brother, James, smirked from across the table, relishing my humiliation. The dinner was meant to celebrate our first anniversary, but it had turned into an ambush. Richard's accusations weren't just personal. They were calculated. A public dismantling of my character in front of the family I tried so hard to join. You think a cheap watch buys you a seat at this table? He'd sneered, tossing the Rolex like it was trash. I'd spent $20, 000 on that watch. Every cent earned through my own grit. But to him, it was worthless because I was. I didn't respond then. Words wouldn't have reached him. Instead, I picked up the broken watch, its weight heavy in my hand, and left the room, Eleanor trailing behind me. In the quiet of our car, she whispered apologies, but they felt hollow. He didn't mean it, she said, her voice fragile. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her how his words had lit a fire in me, how they'd awakened something I'd buried long ago, a hunger for justice, for proving him wrong, for taking back what was mine. Not just my dignity, but something bigger. The Whitmore fortune, the empire he lorded over, wasn't untouchable. I'd spent years learning the cracks in the financial world, and I knew Richard's business was built on shaky ground. That night, as Eleanor slept, I sat at my desk, the broken Rolex beside me, and began to plan. The Whitmore family wasn't just wealthy. They were a dynasty, their name etched into the city's skyline through real estate, investments, and political connections. Richard had inherited it all from his father, a man who'd built the empire with cunning and ruthlessness. But Richard wasn't his father. He was arrogant, careless, and blind to the vulnerabilities in his sprawling portfolio. I'd seen it in the documents I'd glimpsed while working on a deal for his companion, favor he'd grudgingly allowed me to perform. Offshore accounts, questionable loans, partnerships with shell companies that didn't add up. He thought he was invincible, but I knew better. Every empire has a weak point, and I was going to find his. The next morning, I called Marcus, an old friend from my days scraping by in the financial district. Marcus was a hacker, not the kind you see in movies, but a quiet genius who could unravel digital secrets like they were puzzles. I need dirt, I told him over coffee in a diner far from the Whitmore's pristine world. Anything on Richard Whitmore's business dealings. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He knew my tone, focused, unyielding. I wasn't the kid he'd met a decade ago, desperate and green. I was someone with a purpose now, someone who'd been pushed too far. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus delivered. Files, emails, transaction records, pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of Richard's empire as a house of cards. He'd been siphoning money into offshore accounts, evading taxes, and propping up failing investments with shady loans. It wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. I could have gone to the authorities. But that wasn't enough. Richard didn't just need to lose his money. He needed to feel the loss. To know it was me who took it. This wasn't about greed, it was about justice. About showing him what a fraud could do. Eleanor noticed my late nights. The way I'd pore over documents in our study. "What's wrong, David?" she'd ask. Her voice soft, but edged with worry. I'd smile, kiss her forehead, and lie. "Just work. Love." I couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. She was still a Whitmore, and blood runs thicker than vows. But I loved her, or at least I thought I did. That love was the only thing keeping my plan from spiraling into pure vengeance. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from the fallout. But I also wanted her father to pay. By the end of the month, I had a plan. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't clean, but it was precise. I'd use Richard's own greed against him, luring him into a deal too good to pass up, a deal that would expose his vulnerabilities and drain his accounts. The broken Rolex sat on my desk as I worked, a reminder of why I was doing this. Not for the money, but for the moment Richard would realize he'd underestimated me. I wasn't a fraud. I was his reckoning. The plan took shape in the quiet hours, when the city slept and my mind burned with purpose. Marcus's findings were a gold mine, but they were raw, unrefined. I spent nights cross-referencing bank statements, tracing wire transfers, and mapping the web of Richard's financial sins. He'd been careless, trusting his wealth to shield him from scrutiny. But I wasn't just anyone. I'd built my career on seeing what others missed. And now I saw everything, every loophole, every lie. The key was a failing real estate project in Dubai, a luxury hotel that was bleeding money. Richard had sunk millions into it, propping it up with loans from questionable sources. If I could push that project over the edge, the dominoes would fall. I crafted a deal, a mirage of an investment opportunity. Through a shell company I'd set up anonymously. Of course, I posed as an international investor interested in bailing out the Dubai project. The bait was a $50 million infusion, enough to make Richard's eyes light up. But the deal came with strings. He'd need to liquidate certain assets, move money from his offshore accounts, and expose his financial underbelly. I worked with Marcus to create a paper trail so clean it sparkled. Every document forged to perfection. The investor, a fictional magnate named Victor Lang, would demand a meeting in person, forcing Richard to fly halfway across the world while I worked behind the scenes. Getting Richard to bite wasn't hard. I knew his greed, his desperation to maintain the Whitmore legacy. I fed the proposal through a trusted associate of his, someone I'd charmed during my time working on his deals. The associate, oblivious to my involvement, presented it as a lifeline. Richard called a family meeting to discuss it, and I sat there, playing the dutiful son-in-law, nodding as he boasted about the game-changing opportunity. Eleanor squeezed my hand, her smile proud but fragile. She thought I was finally being accepted. James, her brother, was less convinced, his eyes narrowing whenever I spoke. He'd always hated me, saw me as a threat to his inheritance. He wasn't wrong. The meeting was a performance. I listened as Richard outlined his plan to liquidate a chunk of the family's domestic holdings to fund the deal. Beatrice, ever the silent partner, nodded along, her faith in her husband unshakable. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was alive with anticipation. Every step he took toward the deal was a step toward his ruin. I'd structured it so that once he transferred the funds, they'd vanish into an account only I could access, rerouted through layers of untraceable transactions. Marcus had assured me the tech was airtight. Richard would be left with nothing but excuses when the investor disappeared. But there was a risk. Eleanor, She was starting to ask questions, her intuition sharper than I'd given her credit for. One night, as I worked late, she slipped into the study, her nightgown soft against the hardwood floor. "David, what's going on?" Her voice was quiet, but her eyes searched mine, looking for the truth I couldn't give her. I closed my laptop, forcing a smile. "Just a big project. Elle, it's going to be good for us." She didn't believe May could see it in the way her shoulders said, but she didn't push. "Not yet." I hated lying to her. But this wasn't about her. It was about her father. About the man who'd looked at me like I was nothing and thrown my gesture of goodwill into the dirt. The next phase was trickier. Richard was in Dubai, chasing the ghost of Victor Lang, while I worked to unravel his domestic empire. I used my access to his company's systems access he'd never bothered to revoke, assuming I was too insignificant to Maturdo plant discrepancies. Small at first, a missing payment here, a delayed transfer there. Enough to make his investors nervous, to make his board question his judgment. I didn't need to destroy him outright. I just needed to weaken him, to make him desperate enough to double down on the Dubai deal. Marcus helped me hack into his email, sending carefully crafted messages to key partners, hinting at financial trouble. The whispers started spreading, and Richard's empire began to tremble. Eleanor's worry grew. She'd overheard James talking about issues with the company, and she confronted me one evening, her voice shaking. "Is Dad in trouble? Is that why you're working so hard?" I wanted to tell her everything, to pull her into my arms and confess the fire burning inside me. But I couldn't. Not when her loyalty was still split. Not when her love for her father might outweigh her love for me. "It's just business, Elle," I said, my voice steady despite the guilt gnawing at me. "Your father's fine. He's untouchable." The lie tasted bitter, but it bought me time. By the time Richard returned from Dubai, empty-handed and furious, the cracks were showing. His investors were pulling out. His board was in chaos, and his offshore accounts were drained courtesy of my carefully orchestrated transfers. He didn't know it was me. Not yet. But he would. I wanted him to look me in the eye when he realized who'd brought him down. The broken Rolex sat on my desk, its hands frozen at the moment he'd thrown it. It wasn't just a watch anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that I wasn't the fraud he thought I was. I was something far worse as equal. His enemy. His end. Richard's return from Dubai marked the turning point. He stormed into the Whitmore estate, his face a mask of rage and exhaustion, barking orders at his staff as if they were the ones who'd failed him. I watched from the sidelines, invited to the family meeting under the pretense of supporting Eleanor. The truth was, I needed to see his unraveling up close. His voice cracked as he explained the failed deal to Beatrice and James, blaming everyone but himself. The fictional Victor Lang had vanished, along with the $50 million Richard had wired to secure the partnership. He didn't know the money was sitting in an account I controlled, hidden behind layers of encryption Marcus had built. He didn't know I was the one pulling the strings. The room was heavy with tension. Beatrice twisted her pearl necklace, her composure fraying. James, usually smug, looked uneasy, his eyes darting between his father and me. Eleanor sat beside me, her hand cold in mine. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt the weight of it. I kept my expression neutral, nodding sympathetically as Richard ranted about betrayal and incompetence. Inside, I was electric, every nerve alive with the thrill of it. This was justice, not just for the Rolex, not just for his words, but for every moment he'd made me feel less than human. That night, I escalated the plan. Using Richard's own email, I sent a series of messages to his board, confessing to mismanagement and hinting at deeper financial troubles. The messages were subtle, worded in his pompous tone, but they were enough to spark panic. By morning, the board was calling an emergency meeting, and Richard's phone buzzed incessantly with demands for answers. He was too proud to admit he'd been conned, too arrogant to see the trap closing around him. I fed the chaos, leaking snippets of his offshore dealings to a financial journalist I'd cultivated years ago. The story hit the papers the next day, a carefully worded exposé that stopped short of naming me as the source. The Whitmore name, once untouchable, was now synonymous with scandal. Eleanor was unraveling too. She'd always been the glue holding her family together, but the strain was breaking her. She cornered me in our bedroom, her eyes red from crying. "David, tell me you're not involved in this." Her voice was a plea, desperate for reassurance. I wanted to lie, to pull her close and say it was all a coincidence. But her gaze held me captive. "I'm protecting us," I said finally, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, not of her father's ruin, but of me. "What have you done?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. Not yet. The next step was the riskiest. I needed to confront Richard directly, to make him see the cost of his arrogance. I arranged a meeting at his office, claiming I had a solution to his financial woes. He agreed, probably expecting me to beg for his approval, to offer some pathetic fix. Instead, I walked in with the broken Rolex in my pocket and a file of damning evidence printouts of his offshore accounts, emails tying him to illegal loans, proof of the Dubai scam. I laid it all out on his desk, watching his face shift from annoyance to shock to fury. "You think you can blackmail me?" he roared, slamming his fist on the table. "You're nothing, David. A nobody." I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "You called me a fraud, Richard. You threw my gift on the floor like it was garbage. But I'm not the one hiding millions in the Caymans. I'm not the one who's about to lose everything." His eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw fear in them. I didn't tell him I'd already drained his accounts or that his empire was crumbling. I wanted him to discover that himself, to feel the ground give way beneath him. I left the office with the Rolex still in my pocket, its weight a reminder of what I'd started. Eleanor was waiting when I got home. She'd found some of my notes, fragments of the plan I hadn't hidden well enough. "You're destroying my family," she said, her voice breaking. "How could you do this to us?" I tried to explain, to make her see it wasn't about her, that her father had brought this on himself. But she wasn't listening. "I thought you loved me," she said, and the words cut deeper than Richard's ever had. I did love her, but love wasn't enough to stop what I'd set in motion. Not now. The fallout came faster than I'd expected. The board ousted Richard, citing mismanagement. His investors pulled out, and the authorities were circling, sniffing out the illegal deals I'd exposed. The Whitmore fortune, decades of wealth, was evaporating, redirected to accounts I controlled, to be used for something better, something just. I wasn't keeping it for myself. That was never the plan. But Eleanor didn't know that, and her silence was louder than any argument. She moved out the next day, leaving a note that said only, "I need time." I stood in our empty house, the Rolex in my hand, and wondered if I'd gone too far. Eleanor's absence was a wound I hadn't anticipated. The house felt hollow without her, every room echoing with the memory of her laughter, her warmth. I told myself this was about justice, about proving Richard wrong. But now, staring at the empty space where her books used to sit, I wondered if I'd sacrificed too much. The Rolex sat on my nightstand, its cracked face mocking me. I'd won, hadn't I? Richard's empire was in ruins, his name dragged through the mud. His accounts drained. But the victory tasted like ash. I hadn't just taken his fortune. I'd taken Eleanor's trust. Maybe her love. I threw myself into the next phase, trying to drown the guilt. The money I'd siphoned wasn't for might never was. I'd set up a foundation, anonymous, to redirect the funds to charities, to people who'd been crushed by men like Richard. Schools, hospitals, shelters, places the Whitmore wealth had never touched. Despite their public philanthropy, I worked with Marcus to ensure every transfer was untraceable, every dollar accounted for. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was a start. I wanted to believe I could rebuild something good from the wreckage I created. Richard wasn't done fighting. He hired lawyers, investigators, anyone who could salvage his name. They came sniffing around. But Marcus's work was flawless. The trail led nowhere, looping back to Richard's own mistakes. Still, I felt the pressure. James was the wild card. He'd never liked me, and now he had reason to suspect me. He showed up at my office one day, his face tight with anger. "You're behind this, aren't you?" he said, his voice low. Dangerous. I met his gaze, unflinching. "You think I could take down your father? I'm just a fraud. Remember?" The words were sharp, a jab at his family's dismissal of me. He didn't have proof, but his suspicion was enough to keep me on edge. Eleanor called me a week later. Her voice was cold, distant, but she wanted to meet. I agreed, my heart racing with hope and dread. We met at a cafe, neutral ground, far from the Whitmore estate. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "I talked to Dad," she said. "He's broken. David. Not just the money, the shame. He won't eat, won't sleep." I wanted to feel triumph, but her pain stopped me cold. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said, and I meant it. She looked at me, searching for the man she'd married. "Then why did you do it?" she asked. I couldn't answer. Not fully. The truth was too tangled, too raw. I told her about the Rolex, about her father's cruelty, about the years I'd spent proving myself only to be dismissed. I didn't tell her about the money. Not yet. I wanted her to understand why I'd started this, why I couldn't let Richard's word stand. He made me feel like nothing, I said, my voice breaking. I had to show him I wasn't. Eleanor's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "You didn't just hurt him," she said. "You hurt me." She left without another word, and I sat there, the weight of her words heavier than any fortune. The next day, I got a call from Marcus. "They're getting close," he said. One of Richard's investigators had found a loose Thread server log that could tie back to us if they dug deep enough. I told Marcus to bury it, to double the encryption. But the fear was real now. If they traced it to me, I'd lose everything, not just the money, but any chance of winning Eleanor back. I started to wonder if I'd miscalculated, if my need for revenge had blinded me to the consequences. But there was no turning back. The plan was in motion, and I had to see it through. I met with Richard again, this time at his request. He looked older, his face lined with stress, his arrogance replaced by desperation. "I need your help," he said, the words clearly painful for him. "You're good with numbers. There's got to be a way to fix this." I almost laughed. The man who'd called me a fraud was begging for my help. I leaned back in my chair, the Rolex in my pocket. "Maybe I am a fraud," I said, my voice cold. "But I'm the only one who can save you." It was a lie, but it felt good to say it, to see him squirm. I promised to look at his books, to buy myself time. In truth, I was planning the final blow. That night, I sat with the Rolex, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't just a watch anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd fought for, everything I'd lost. I thought of Eleanor, of the life we'd planned, of the man I'd been before this consumed me. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stop. Not until Richard knew the full cost of his words. Not until I'd reclaimed what he'd taken from Mimi pride. My place. My peace. The air in the Whitmore estate felt heavier now, like the walls themselves were closing in. Richard's desperation was palpable. His once commanding presence reduced to a man scrambling to save his legacy. I played my part, sitting in his office, poring over his ledgers as if I could find a miracle. But every number I touched was a lie I'd crafted. Every loss a step in my plan. He watched me, his eyes searching for hope, unaware that I was the architect of his ruin. The Rolex in my pocket felt like a burning coal, a reminder of why I'd started this, but also of what I was becoming. Eleanor's distance was a constant ache. She'd stopped calling, stopped texting. I'd see her sometimes, passing through the estate to check on her mother, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. I wanted to tell her the truth, to show her the foundation I'd built with her father's money, to prove I wasn't the monster she feared. But the truth was a risk I couldn't take, not yet. If she knew, she might go to Richard, and everything would unravel. So I kept silent, letting the gap between us widen, hoping I could bridge it when this was over. James was another problem. He'd been digging, talking to Richard's investigators, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. He cornered me one evening in the estate's library, his face flushed with anger. "I know it's you, David," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're not as clever as you think." I kept my expression calm, but my heart raced. "Prove it," I said, my tone steady. He didn't have anything concrete, not yet, but his suspicion was a ticking bomb. I needed to move faster, to finish this before he found the evidence he was looking for. The final blow was ready. I'd set up a second deal, another trap disguised as salvation. This time, it was a merger with a failing company I'd fabricated, one that would require Richard to sell off his remaining assets to fund it. The paperwork was impeccable, every detail designed to lure him in. I presented it to him as a last-ditch effort to save the Whitmore name, a way to consolidate what was left of his empire. He was hesitant, his trust shaken by the Dubai fiasco, but he was also desperate. "This could work," he said, his voice hollow. I nodded, hiding the thrill that coursed through me. This was the moment his empire would collapse entirely. Marcus called me that night, his voice tense. "They're closer than I thought," he said. The investigators had found a digital footprint, a trace of one of our hacks. It wasn't enough to pin me, but it was enough to make Marcus nervous. "We need to pull the plug," he urged. I refused. We were too close. The merger deal already in motion. If I stopped now, Richard might recover, and everything Eleanor's pain, my lies, the Rolex would be for nothing. "Cover our tracks," I told Marcus. "I'll handle the rest." The merger went through faster than I'd expected. Richard signed the papers, liquidating his last holdings to fund it. The money flowed into my accounts, redirected to the foundation, leaving Richard with nothing but debt and a tarnished name. The company he'd merged with didn't exist. Its CEO, another ghost I'd created. When the truth came out, the press descended, splashing Richard's failure across every headline. The Whitmore dynasty was dead, and I'd killed it. But the victory was hollow. Eleanor showed up at our house that night, her face pale, her eyes blazing. "It was you," she said. Not a question, but a statement. She'd found an email I hadn't deleted, a draft I'd sent to Marcus. I didn't deny it. I couldn't. I did it for us. I said, the words sounding weaker than I'd meant. For us. She spat. You destroyed my family. David. You lied to me. I tried to explain. To tell her about the foundation. About the good I was doing with the money. But she wouldn't listen. You're not the man I married, she said, and walked out. I stood in the empty house, the Rolex in my hand, its cracked face staring back at me. I'd won. But at what cost? Richard was ruined. His empire gone. But Eleanor was gone too. The justice I'd sought felt like a Pyrrhic victory, a fire that had consumed everything I loved. I sat at my desk, the weight of my choices pressing down on me, and wondered if there was a way to fix this, to make things right. The foundation was a start, but it wasn't enough. I needed to show Eleanor, to show myself, that I could be more than the man who'd torn her family apart. The days after Eleanor left were a blur of silence and regret. The house was too big, too empty. Every corner a reminder of what I'd lost. The Rolex sat on my desk, its broken hands frozen in time, a relic of my vengeance. I'd dismantled Richard's empire, redirected his wealth to something better. But the cost was higher than I'd imagined. I thought I was fighting for justice, for my pride. But all I'd done was break the woman I loved. The headlines screamed of the Whitmore collapse, and I couldn't escape the guilt that I'd orchestrated it all. I threw myself into the foundation, hoping work could numb the pain. The money was flowing to schools, to clinics, to people who needed it more than the Whitmores ever had. I visited one of the shelters we'd funded, saw kids playing in a yard that hadn't existed a month ago, their laughter a stark contrast to the chaos in my heart. This was what I'd told myself it was for making a difference, righting wrongs. But it wasn't enough to fill the void Eleanor had left. I needed her to see it, to understand why I'd done it, to believe I wasn't the monster she thought I was. Richard was a shadow of himself. I saw him on the news, leaving a courtroom, his face gaunt, his suit ill-fitting now that he couldn't afford his tailor. The authorities had seized what was left of his assets, but they'd never traced the money to me. Marcus had made sure of that. Still, Richard's investigators were relentless, and James was leading the charge. He called me, his voice thick with rage. I'm going to bury you, David, he said. You think you've won, but I'll find what you did. I didn't respond. Let him try. The evidence was gone, buried in digital quicksand. But his threat lingered, a reminder that this wasn't over. I reached out to Eleanor, leaving voicemails she didn't return, sending letters she didn't answer. Finally, I went to her mother's house, where she'd been staying. Beatrice answered the door, her face a mask of disdain. You've done enough, she said, but there was no venom in her voice, only exhaustion. I begged to see Eleanor, and after a long moment, she let me in. Eleanor was in the living room, surrounded by boxes her family's life packed away as they prepared to sell the estate. She looked at me, her eyes tired but fierce. What do you want, David? She asked. I told her everything. The foundation, the schools, the shelters. I told her how her father's money was helping people, how I'd never kept a cent for myself. I pulled the Rolex from my pocket, its cracked face glinting in the dim light. This is why I did it, I said, my voice breaking. He called me a fraud, threw this away like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I wanted to prove him wrong, to show him what I could do. Eleanor's face softened, but only slightly. You didn't just prove him wrong, she said. You destroyed him. And you lied to me. I had no defense. She was right. She asked for time, and I gave it to her. I left the Rolex on the table, a gesture I hoped she'd understand. Back home, I focused on the foundation, but the work felt hollow without her. Marcus called with an update. James's investigators had hit a dead end, but he was still digging. He's obsessed, Marcus said. Be careful. I nodded, but my mind was on Eleanor. I needed to make things right, not just for her, but for myself. I wasn't the man Richard had called a fraud, but I wasn't a hero either. I was something in between, and I needed to find a way to live with that. I started writing to Eleanor. Not emails or texts, but real letters. Handwritten. Pouring out my heart. I told her about the kids at the shelter. About the families we'd helped. About the man I wanted to be. I didn't ask for forgiveness. Not directly. I just wanted her to know I was trying. One day, she wrote back. A single page. Her handwriting neat but shaky. I see what you're doing, she wrote. But it doesn't erase what you did. I need to understand who you are now. It wasn't much, but it was hope. I invited her to visit one of the shelters, to see the work for herself. To my surprise, she came. She walked through the playground, her face unreadable, watching the kids chase each other under the new swings. This is because of you, she asked. I nodded. Because of your father's money, I said. But for them. She didn't respond, but she stayed. Her presence a quiet possibility. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Eleanor's visit to the shelter was a turning point. Fragile but real. She didn't say much as we walked through the new classrooms. The walls painted bright with donated supplies. But I saw her eyes linger on the kids, on the hope in their faces. I didn't push her to talk. Didn't ask for forgiveness. I just let her see what I'd built from the ashes of her father's empire. When she left, she took the Rolex with her, slipping it into her purse without a word. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a step toward what? I wasn't sure. Richard's downfall was complete. The courts had frozen his accounts. His properties were sold off, and the Whitmore name was a punchline in the financial world. I watched him on TV, a broken man pleading his case to reporters who didn't care. Part of me wanted to feel triumph, but all I felt was emptiness. I'd taken everything from him, just as I'd planned, but it hadn't filled the hole he'd left when he called me a fraud. It hadn't brought Eleanor back. The foundation was thriving, but it wasn't enough to quiet the guilt that gnawed at me. James was still a threat. He'd stopped calling, but I knew he hadn't given up. Marcus warned me he'd hired a new investigator, someone with a reputation for digging up what others couldn't. I doubled down on security, making sure every trace of my involvement was buried. But the fear lingered, a constant reminder that my victory was fragile. If James found proof, it wouldn't just be my freedom at stake, it would be any chance of rebuilding with Eleanor. I couldn't let that happen. I kept writing to her, letters that poured out my regrets, my hopes, my truth. I told her about the man I'd been before her, the kid who'd fought for every scrap of success, the man who'd let anger twist him into something he didn't recognize. She didn't respond, but she didn't return the letters either. I took it as a sign to keep going, to keep showing her I could change. I threw myself into the foundation, expanding its reach, funding more shelters, more schools. Every project was a brick in the wall I was building, a way to prove I was more than my mistakes. One evening, Eleanor showed up at the house. No call, no warning, just her, standing in the doorway, the Rolex in her hand. I fixed it, she said, holding it out. The cracked face was gone, replaced with a new one, the hands ticking softly. I took it, my fingers brushing hers, and for a moment, I thought she might pull away. But she didn't. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said, her voice steady but soft. But I see what you're doing. I see you trying. It was an absolution, but it was enough. We started talking. Slowly at first. Coffee dates. Then dinners. Always on neutral ground. She asked about the foundation. About the people we were helping. And I told her everything except the details of how I'd taken the money. She didn't ask. And I didn't offer. I wanted to believe we could rebuild. But there was still a wall between us. Built of lies and pain. I was determined to tear it down. Brick by brick. Even if it took years. James's investigator got too close. Marcus caught wind of a hack attempt on our servers. A sophisticated probe that nearly broke through. We shut it down. But it was a wake-up call. I met with Marcus in a dive bar. Far from prying eyes. We need to end this. He said. His voice tight. Let it go? David. You've won. But I hadn't. Not really. Richard was ruined. But Eleanor wasn't mine. Not fully. And James was still out there. Hunting me. I told Marcus to keep the defenses up. To buy me time. I wasn't ready to walk away. Eleanor and I spent more time together. And I started to see glimpses of the woman I'd fallen in love with. She smiled more. Laughed sometimes. But there was still a shadow in her eyes. One night. Over dinner. She reached across the table and took my hand. I want to believe in you. She said. But I need to know you won't lie to me again. I promised her I wouldn't. And I meant it. But the truth was still there. Buried. Waiting to surface. I knew I'd have to tell her everything eventually. But not yet. Not until I was sure she'd stay. The Rolex sat on my desk. Its new face gleaming. It wasn't just a watch, Anna Maria, it was a symbol of what I'd done. What I'd lost. And what I was fighting to regain. I was ready to keep fighting. For her. For us. For the man I wanted to be. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance. Eleanor and I were rebuilding. Step by cautious step. Our conversations growing longer. Our silences less heavy. She started spending nights at the house again. Though she kept her own apartment. A reminder that trust was still fragile. The foundation was thriving. Its impact spreading. And she began to take an active role. Visiting projects. Meeting the people we'd helped. Her presence gave the work meaning. Made it feel like more than a penance for my sins. But the shadow of the truth hung over me. A weight I couldn't shake. I knew I'd have to tell her everything. To lay bare the lies I'd told. But I was terrified of losing her again. James hadn't given up. His investigator was relentless. Digging into every corner of my life. My past. My connections. Marcus kept me one step ahead. But it was a game of inches. One night. He called me in a panic. They found something. He said. A transaction. A tiny slip in our encryption. Enough to raise questions, but not enough to prove anything. I told him to bury it deeper. To make it disappear. But the fear was real now. If James connected the dots, it wouldn't just be my freedom at stake, it would be Eleanor's faith in me. The fragile hope we'd built. I decided to confront James. Not to confess, but to end this. I invited him to a bar. A public place where he couldn't lose control. He showed up. His eyes burning with hate. I know it's you. David. He said. His voice low. You took everything. I leaned back. The Rolex on my wrist now. Its new face ticking steadily. You've got no proof. I said. My voice calm. And you never will. I wasn't taunting him, I was stating a fact. Marcus had made sure of it. James's jaw tightened. But he didn't push. He knew I was right. For now. The trail was cold. Eleanor and I grew closer. But the truth was a wall I couldn't climb. One night, as we sat on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder, She asked the question I'd been dreading. David, how did you do it? Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it. She wasn't asking about the foundation, she was asking about her father's ruin. I took a deep breath, the Rolex heavy on my wrist. I need you to trust me, I said, stalling. I did what I did because I had to. Because he hurt us. She pulled back, her eyes searching mine. Tell me, she said. All of it. I told her. The offshore accounts. The fake deals. The money I'd redirected. I told her about Marcus. About the nights I'd spent planning. About the rage that had driven me. I told her about the foundation. How every dollar was helping people her father had ignored. She listened. Her face unreadable. Her hands clenched in her lap. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. You lied to me, she said finally. You used me. I shook my head. Desperate. I love you. Elle. I did it for us. For what he did to us. She stood, her eyes wet. I need to think, she said, and left. Days passed without a word. I threw myself into the foundation, but it felt hollow. The Rolex was a constant reminder. It's ticking a countdown to something I couldn't name. Then, one morning, she showed up at the house, her face calm but resolute. I've talked to Dad, she said. He's broken, David, but he's still my father. I can't hate him. Not like you do. I braced myself, expecting her to walk away for good. But she kept going. I've seen what you've done with the money. I've seen the kids, the families. It doesn't erase what you did, but it means something. She paused, her eyes meeting mine. I want to be part of it. I want to help. It wasn't forgiveness. Not fully, but it was a start. We worked together, side by side, building something new from the wreckage of her family's fortune. Richard faded into the background, a man diminished but alive, living off what little he had left. James gave up, his investigator hitting a dead end. The threat was gone, but the scars remained. Eleanor and I rebuilt, slowly, learning to trust again. The Rolex stayed on my wrist, a reminder of what I'd done, what I'd lost, and what I'd gained. I wasn't a fraud. Not anymore. I was a man who'd fallen, who'd hurt the people he loved, but who was trying to make it right. And for the first time, I believed I could.